I was driving back home after visiting a friend. It was late, and I'd planned to be home long before the storm hit. But I took a wrong turn somewhere, and now I was stuck on this empty highway in the middle of nowhere. The storm was getting worse, and I hadn't seen another car for miles. The GPS was no help, and obviously my phone had no signal in these woods. Suddenly, the car's engine sputters. First thought ran through my head when I heard that sound. I should have paid attention to the warnings it has been giving me the last few weeks. The lights flicker. I wanted to bring the car to halt, or else the engine may die. The car coasts to a stop. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my breath quickening. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, my car broke down with a loud sputtering sound. Alone in the middle of a storm with nothing but trees and darkness around me. I sit there for a moment, staring out into the rain-soaked night, weighing my options. Then I see a faint light up ahead, flickering in the distance, just beyond the tree line. And then I saw it. A light. Maybe a house or a gas station? I wanted to walk to it and see if I could find any help. Or is it a crazy thought? I don't know. In this pouring rain and windy storm. Broken car. I thought, how worse could it be? I decided to leave the safety of the car. Grabbing my phone and a flashlight, I stepped out into the storm, the wind and rain instantly soaking through my clothes. I start walking towards the light, my flashlight beam bobbing up and down as I stumble over the uneven ground. The light seems to flicker, like it's getting further away with every step. The more I walked, the more I felt like I wasn't getting any closer. And then, the unsettling feeling hit me. I wasn't alone. There's a rustle in the trees. I stop, holding my breath, trying to focus on these noises, the flashlight beam sweeping across the dense underbrush. Nothing. Or I hope it's nothing. I force myself to keep moving as fast as I can. Finally, I reach a small, run-down house at the edge of the woods. The light is coming from an old lantern hanging on the porch, swinging in the wind. The place looks abandoned. I'm not sure I would find anything helpful in there, and it struck me. Maybe I can just wait it out here instead of waiting in the car. Can't decide. Hundreds of questions ran through my head, looking at the condition of the house. My gut feeling was not to step into the unknown, but I have no choice. I reached the house and for a moment stepped into a tiny sunroom on the porch. The storm quietened. I felt relieved, but that relief quickly faded. Something about this place felt wrong. I walk up to the door and knock. The sound echoes eerily inside. After a long pause, the door creaks open on its own, revealing a dimly lit interior. I hesitate again, but the storm is unforgiving, and I finally step inside. The entrance is dusty and cluttered, with old furniture draped in white sheets. The air is thick with the smell of mildew. As I take a few cautious steps forward, the door slams shut behind me. The door, it slammed shut on its own. My heart was pounding. I came to the conclusion, I'm trapped. I turn to leave, but the door won't budge. The wind howls outside, rattling the windows. Then I hear it, a faint shuffling sound coming from deeper inside the house. And then I heard some shuffling sounds. My heart pounded so fast I thought it would explode off my chest. I hear footsteps. Is there someone in the house? I slowly turn, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand. The shuffling sound grows louder, closer, and suddenly a figure steps into the dim light. A man, tall and gaunt, his clothes tattered, his eyes wild and unblinking. He's holding something in his hand, something sharp. "Lost, are you?" he says. I freeze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but there's nowhere to go. The man takes a step closer, the object in his hand glinting in the weak light. I tried to speak, to explain, but the words caught in my throat. I was paralyzed with fear. Just as he reaches out to me, there's a flash of lightning illuminating the room in a blinding white light. I see his face clearly for the first time. His eyes are hollow, empty. He grins, and it's not a friendly smile. In a frightening, deep voice, he says, "You should have stayed in your car." The light fades, and the room plunges into darkness. The last thing I feel is a cold hand on my arm pulling me deeper into the house. I felt his hand on me. And then nothing. Darkness, cold, silence. Suddenly I jolted awake on my living room couch. It's morning. The storm has passed and sunlight is streaming through the windows. I sit up, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. Oh, it was just a dream, a nightmare. But it felt so real. I stand, shaking off the lingering fear. But as I turn to leave, something catches my eye on the table, a muddy footprint leading from the front door to where I was sleeping. And next to it, a small, rusted knife. I stare at the knife, my blood running cold. But was it really just a dream? Stormy evening, the kind where the rain pelted the windows so hard it almost seemed like it wanted to break through. I was driving home after a long day at work, feeling exhausted, yet somehow energized by the thought of finally relaxing in my cozy house. As a part of my job duties, my work involved field trips where we test environmental factors in woods once a year. I had to drive 3 hours away from city into woods. It was late, and the highways were eerily empty, a stark contrast to their usual bustling state. As I drove along the winding, desolate road, the rain intensified, and my wipers struggled to keep up. The faint glow of my headlights barely penetrated the thick curtain of rain. That's when I saw him, a figure on the side of the road, drenched, waving his arm frantically. I'm not usually the type to stop for strangers, especially on a night like this, but something about him made me slow down. Maybe it was the way he looked so desperate, or perhaps it was the storm playing tricks on my mind. I couldn't leave him out there in that downpour. I pulled over and rolled down my window just enough to speak. "Do you need a ride?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "Please," he replied, his voice shaky. "My car broke down. I just need to get to the next town." I hesitated for a moment, but the cold and rain seemed to seep into my bones, urging me to let him in. With a sigh, I unlocked the door, and he quickly slid into the passenger seat, bringing with him the scent of wet earth and something else, something metallic. We drove in silence for a while, the only sounds being the relentless rain and the soft hum of the engine. The man was quiet, almost too quiet. I stole a glance at him and noticed he was gripping something tightly in his hand, but I couldn't make out what it was. "So where exactly are you headed?" I asked, trying to break the tension. "Just up ahead," he muttered, not looking at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His clothes were soaked, yet his shoes were oddly clean, and that smell. It was stronger now, almost like copper. My heart started to race as I realized what it was. Blood. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. I was alone in the middle of nowhere, with a stranger who might be dangerous. The road stretched on endlessly with no sign of civilization in sight. The storm outside seemed to grow fiercer, matching the turmoil inside me. Finally he spoke. "You can drop me off at the next turn," he said, pointing to a narrow, unmarked road ahead. I was a little relieved he is planning to get down. "Maybe I will, okay?" And again my mind warned, do I have to take that narrow, unknown road off the highway? Should I ask him if I could drop him off on the shoulder? It was too dark to make out anything out of his expressions. I couldn't dare to ask. Every instinct in my body screamed at me not to take that turn, but what choice did I have? I nodded, swallowing hard, and made the turn. The road was even darker and more isolated than the highway. The trees on either side loomed over us like silent sentinels, and the rain seemed to fall even harder if that was possible. My mind started reiterating one single thought this entire time. Why on earth would I allow a stranger in the car in the first place? I drove slowly, my hands trembling on the wheel. The man sat still, watching the road ahead with an unsettling calmness. Then, without warning, he spoke again. "Stop here," he said. I pulled over, my heart pounding in my chest. The man opened the door and stepped out into the rain. For a moment, he just stood there, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. Was it gratitude or something else? Then, without a word, he turned and walked into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. I sat there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't wait to see where he went. I floored the gas pedal and sped away, not daring to look back. I finally made it home, soaked in sweat despite the cold. The storm had followed me, and the wind howled around the house as I locked the doors and bolted the windows. I collapsed onto the couch, trying to calm down, but my mind was racing. Who was that man? And why did I have the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible? As I sat there, the storm grew wild, the lights flickered, and the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I fumbled for my phone, only to realize that I had left it in the car. I was alone in the dark, with the storm raging outside. I tried to convince myself that I was safe, that the man was long gone, but something nagged at me. I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like someone breathing. It was coming from behind me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly I turned around, my eyes straining to see in the darkness. There, in the faint light of a flash of lightning, I saw him, the man from the road, standing in my living room, dripping wet, and holding that same metallic object in his hand. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. He took a step toward me, and I felt the blood drain from my face. "I told you to drop me off," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the storm. "But you didn't." Before I could react, the lights flickered back on, and he was gone, vanished as if he had never been there. I was left, sitting in my living room, trembling, with only the sound of the storm outside and the memory of his haunting words. For days, I couldn't sleep. I kept expecting to see him in the shadows, waiting for me. I even called the police, but there was no sign of the man, no trace of him anywhere. It was as if he had never existed. But I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced, and I knew that somewhere out there, he was still waiting. It was a typical evening, and I was driving home from a late shift at work. Our boss hosted a fantastic party to celebrate the company's success in achieving outstanding sales. It was in a vineyard, a peaceful place, little away from civilization. I was thinking about our conversations at the gathering. It was around midnight, and the highway was mostly empty, save for the occasional car speeding by. It was the kind of night where the silence in the car was almost deafening, and the hum of the tires on the asphalt was strangely soothing. I had the radio on low, just to break the monotony. The weather was calm, not a cloud in sight, but the moon was hidden behind a thick haze, casting an eerie pale light over the road. The drive was uneventful until I noticed a car following me at a distance. It was nothing unusual at first, just another car on the highway. But then I realized it had been behind me for quite a while, matching my speed, never getting too close, but never falling too far behind. I shrugged it off. Maybe they were just going the same way I was. But as I continued, it started to feel strange. No matter how fast or slow I went, the car stayed at the same distance. I decided to test it out and changed lanes, but the car followed. A slight unease began to creep in. I shook my head, telling myself I was being paranoid. After all, it's a public road. Anyone could be driving there. I glanced at my rearview mirror again and saw that the car had gotten a bit closer. I could now make out its shape better, a dark sedan with tinted windows. I couldn't see the driver, but I could feel their eyes on me. To ease my nerves, I turned up the radio, hoping the music would drown out my growing anxiety. It didn't help. My mind was racing. Why were they following me? What did they want? As I approached the exit to my neighborhood, I decided to see if they were really following me, or if it was just a coincidence. Instead of taking my usual exit, I stayed on the highway. The car followed. My heart started hammering inside me. This wasn't a coincidence. They were definitely following me. I took the next exit and quickly turned onto a side street. The sedan followed, its headlights glaring in my mirrors. I took another turn, then another, weaving through the quiet suburban streets, trying to lose them. But no matter what I did, they stayed right behind me. I was getting desperate. I couldn't lead them to my house. I didn't want whoever was driving that car to know where I lived. I needed to think fast. I spotted a small convenience store up ahead, its neon sign flickering in the night. I decided to pull in and see what they would do. I turned into the parking lot and parked right in front of the store, where the lights were brightest. The sedan hesitated for a moment, then slowly drove past, continuing down the road. I watched as it disappeared around the corner, my pulse slowly beginning to settle. Maybe I was overreacting after all. I sat in the car for a few minutes, trying to calm myself down. The store was quiet, and there were no other customers around. The cashier inside looked half asleep, barely paying attention. I debated whether to go inside or just drive home, but the thought of that car coming back made me stay put for a little longer. After a while, I convinced myself that it was just some random driver who'd coincidentally been going the same way. I decided it was safe to head home. I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, taking a different route back just to be sure. As I neared my street, I checked my mirrors repeatedly, but there was no sign of the sedan. Relieved, I turned onto my road, the familiar sight of my house coming into view. The porch light was on, a comforting beacon in the darkness. I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine. Finally letting out a long breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I sat there for a moment, collecting myself, then reached over to grab my bag from the passenger seat. That's when I noticed something in the rearview mirror that made my blood run cold. There, in the back seat, was a shadow. A figure slouched low, as if trying not to be seen. My heart nearly stopped. How had they gotten into my car? And more importantly, why hadn't I noticed until now? For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I kept my eyes on the mirror, trying to make out who or what it was. My mind raced, thinking of every possible explanation. None of them good. Then the figure slowly sat up, and I saw it was a man. He was staring right at me through the mirror, his expression unreadable. He didn't say a word, just sat there, watching me. Panic surged through me. I fumbled with the door handle, practically throwing myself out of the car. I ran to the front door, my hands shaking as I unlocked it and bolted inside. I locked the door behind me, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I stood there in the hallway, trying to calm myself down. After what felt like an eternity, I finally worked up the courage to peek out the window. The car was still in the driveway, but the back seat was empty. The man was gone. I never saw him again after that night. I don't know how he got into my car or what he wanted, but every time I drive home late at night, I find myself glancing into the rearview mirror just to make sure I'm really alone.